Well, it was so great to hear those thought-provoking, short, sharp talks from Sarah and Stephen. The importance of capturing history through stories and signposts. It's time now for some questions to hear from Sarah and Stephen and have a bit of a discussion about these ideas. This first one's for you, Sarah. The past is so vast, that rhymes. Where does someone start on a journey to rediscover history? Where do you begin?
Yeah, wow. That's a really good question. I think read. Read. And that might mean, in this day and age, turn off social media. And
you're asking too much already.
Yeah. But in terms of like kind of basic where to start, think about a subject area that interests you.
Yeah.
Maybe something of your own country or the British Empire or ancient Rome, whatever it is that interests you, about which you'd like to know more, and just start reading books. And also read the great books.
Yeah.
Read the great books of Western civilization. Read, like I picked up a few weeks ago, Augustine's Confessions. It's written in the early centuries AD. It's about his life. I mean, these kind of biographies, literature written in the past, they are just such a rich window into the past. So, yeah, switch off social media and read books.
Read the ones that have stood this test of time. Yeah, that's right. All right, Stephen. This one's from Jeff from Toowoomba. Hey, Jeff. This is about the biblical story in particular. How important is pursuing the good, or I guess retrieving the good, as you discussed, the beauty and the good? How important is that in the Bible? Do we see that in the Bible?
Yeah, the Bible obviously is a book is going from somewhere in history to a future. And I think what we've forgotten perhaps in the West is that's not a natural way of thinking of how the world works across the world. The Bible's given us that picture of we're going to somewhere. And we're going to somewhere that is the good. And when it starts in Genesis, which talks about God creating and he saw that it was good, it was meant that it was fit for purpose. It wasn't perfect in the sense that everything was pristine. It was that it was fit for purpose. And I think when we're aligning ourselves with things that I think are fit for purpose, when we know the direction we're going in, and we do live in an ahistorical age where it's sound-bited, it's TikTok video, it's, our attention span's getting shorter and shorter. It's very hard to see what the good is unless you span things out. And I think the biblical vision of the good starts with a story that starts in a garden and ends in a garden inside a city, and it shows a trajectory, but along the way you get the bad and you get the questionable. So at all stages you're sifting things out. So the Bible, although it talks about the good, isn't squeamish about the bad. And I think that's interesting. Yeah.
And as a historian, Sarah, how do you approach the histories in the Bible? Do you see the same thing that Stephen's seeing here?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when you study history, one of the things that becomes abundantly clear is that, look, there's this verse in the book of Judges and elsewhere that in each age, every person does what is right in their own eyes.
Right.
And when you study history, one of the things that is abundantly clear is that every civilization, every society has this sense, most often of a good, but often in a very self-defined way. And so knowing the biblical account of the fact that humanity is made in God's image and yet fundamentally broken and turning inwards, knowing that means that when we look at the past, we can actually see that kind of brokenness and its outworkings in human history.
Right, and you talked about this in your example, Sarah, just a human desire for justice.
Yeah.
And our next question ties to that. If there are inalienable rights, as you spoke about, how do oppressed groups find those rights? Where do they begin?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Look, we don't have long, so I think it's good here to use a historical example. Actually, historically, in those civilizations that have had access to the Bible, actually the most oppressed and marginalised groups have found their story of liberation from oppression that has enabled them to articulate their injustice in the pages of the Bible. So, for example, if you look at the antebellum South, so the southern United States that had the institution of slavery before the Civil War, where did the black Christians turn? They where did the black Africans who were enslaved turn? They turned to Christianity because what they find in the pages of the Bible is a story of God's people who are liberated by God from slavery. And so where they find their ability to articulate that slavery is wrong is actually in the ultimate justice and in a God who embodies justice and who gives us this story of Israel being liberated from injustice. Right. I mean, likewise, even a more recent historical example, the fact that in the civil rights movement in the United States, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right, he's preaching a thoroughly Christian message. So again, he's finding the articulation of the right and the good and liberation from injustice in the Bible, in the Bible's depiction that every human being is of equal moral worth.
Stephen, you spoke a lot about wrestling with the cancel culture kind of age that we're in now. If you could just piggyback off Sarah's answer, how do we engage, or where do oppressed groups today begin? Where do they go for their inalienable rights? Well,
that's interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking the other example of being the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. One of the things we're loath to do, I think, especially if you're in a position of power, is to admit how wrong you might have got things because you might lose power. And so the Truth and Reconciliation was daring, and I don't think it could have been established anywhere other than somewhere that had a very Christianised framework in it. But it was looking back at the past and acknowledging it. And I think unless cultures are able to do that. Now, I think the nervousness to not go back and not allow cancel culture is because the framework of how you go forward isn't in place. There's not a forgiveness culture at the moment. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa didn't say you get off scot-free, but it allowed the stories to be told and reconciliation to be attempted. Now, we've got our own reconciliation issues in Australia, so we don't even have to look to South Africa for that. And I wonder, my concern is that we don't have a big enough narrative of how we could deal with the ramifications of finding out things about history that we don't like to hear. So we become self-defensive a little bit. We shut down and we go either or. And we go, no, this is a complex issue and we need to unpack it. And you need to unpack it in a community where there's some level of good faith. And I think that's where we're struggling. I'm not sure our community has a level of good faith enough that we could unpack some of those things well enough at the moment. And I think we need to work with that.
Right. The truth is often in the nuance, isn't it? You've got to hold together all those tensions. This is for both of you. I'm sure this quote is familiar to you, that Christianity is the opiate of the masses. Is that true? Is Christianity something that dulls people to finding true self-actualization?
Okay, so that's a great question. And just in case anyone doesn't know the provenance of the quotation, it's from Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. So one of the reasons why this is such a great kind of thing to talk about is the fact that, look, I won't repeat, it's a really lovely kind of dovetail to what I said earlier about, look, oppressed groups historically actually finding in the pages of the Bible the arguments they need to actually resist slavery, for example. And there are countless examples of this historically, which fly in the face of this idea that it's the opiate of the masses. But even in a more contemporary sense, I mean, the fact that if you look at the idea, for example, like if that were true, and you would look at, say, the history of the Anglican Church as an instrument in that sense, it would be, of the British Empire. And yet, there are more Anglicans today in the country of Nigeria alone than there are in Britain. And likewise, even extrapolated to a larger scale, actually more than half the world's Christians, so hundreds of millions, live in the global south, right? So if Christianity is merely the opiate of the masses, then we can't actually make sense of any of those facts, the fact that the global south are actually racing towards Christianity.
And look, and when Marx said that, he said it in the context that religion was giving comfort to oppressed people. So we always quote the first bit, but underneath that, he's acknowledging that whether opiate or not, and so it was a comfort issue for people who were oppressed. The question I'd say is, well, choose your opiate. It's not a difference between the opiate of the masses being this historical religion or complete liberty and clarity in life. I don't look around our present and look, wow, people are really clear-headed and level-headed about where they're at. I see rising levels of anxiety. We don't know where we're going. We don't know where we're coming from. And if you don't know where you're coming from, as I was saying in my talk, it's very hard to determine where you're going. And, you know, there's the old Irish saying, if someone gets lost and they're asking for directions and the Irish farmer speaking to them said, well, I wouldn't start from here if you're trying to get there. Well, where do you start from? So I think when Mark said that, he was saying there is a comfort level in Christianity, but it's choose your opiate. It's not a case that we're just, it's either religion, which is, you know, mystified and sort of dull, and everything else is bright and breezy. It's not like that in our culture at the moment. We don't know where history's taking us, and it feels like a roller coaster. So people are looking for comfort somewhere.
No, that's so helpful. You spoke, Stephen, of signposts. How do you determine the signposts you look to in the past and for the future?
Yeah.
How do you figure those out?
Well, I think you'd have to, you want to test things. Do things last?
Yeah.
And do they last across contexts? And I guess that's why with Christianity has been very good at being in different contexts and shaping itself like the culture but not subsumed by it. But when we think about signposts, we want to honour the past in a way, in little ways, and I don't think we do that very well. And as I've reflected on my father's experience of losing all the signposts in his life. One of the things that was beautiful about it, and my younger brother mentioned it to me, he said, many people from a Western setting are in aged care facilities being looked after by people from cultures who honour old people.
Yes.
We don't even honour old people, never mind, or, you know, ageing people such as my good self. So we look at the past and we're a bit afraid of it, so we don't want the signposts, and we think that we're confident enough to go, well, we know where we're going. So I think other cultures are better at leaning into the past for good or ill, and I think we can't lean into the past if we don't have a robust perspective on how bad we can be. And I think we're trying to be bright and shiny all the time. And we do it with social media. We delete our search history, we swipe left or right, or we, filter our faces or whatever we're doing. We're trying to blank out the warts and all of our lives and our histories, I think. And that's an existential thing as much as anything.
Right. And you lose beauty too when you do that.
You do. And that's what I love old art because of watching how even humans were painted through the medieval era and then into Rembrandt and then I love watching that progression. But if you take that out, you just get this thin slice of now all the time. Right. And I don't think that's helpful.
Yeah. Sarah, you talked about telling stories as a way into history and grappling with our history and facing it. Apart from reading, can you tell us more about that? What does that look like to engage with history through story?
Yeah, the kind of stories of the past. Yeah, this is really interesting. It's particularly evident, I think, because I happen to be writing this kind of thing from a perspective of a white Australian, and we're a culture that tells stories less than other cultures, like the culture that I'm in, less than other cultures. So my husband, for example, is from a very rich storytelling community of people in the southern United States, and also historically Hungarian Jews. They tell stories. And so I think there's also a sense in which the stories that families pass down, the stories that communities pass down, are actually the stories that are enabling people to think about their history as well. Yeah. And of course, even more broadly, like, look, obviously I'm a Christian. For me, and the community that I'm part of, the kind of the ultimate family and community I'm part of is the church. Well, actually, the church is part of a transcendent story, the story of God's people, which, like Steve was talking about before, has this incredibly long and transhistorical arc. And it's actually a story of people adopted originally from God's people who were historically Jews, but now from every culture and every language group and every nation. And so actually, even when Christians think of themselves as being part of a community who are part of God's story, that has incredible riches for us.
Yeah, and it's an inclusive story because of that very reason.
It is, actually, and this is historically one of the most radical things that has ever been argued in history. This is an invitation that crosses, it's not an invitation for an elite, but an invitation to people regardless of class and gender and background and ethnicity to become and be part of God's people. Yeah.
Sarah, you talked about Christians in history often being the leaders in important social change, and how the value system contributed to that, and how often those oppressed groups found for themselves in the Bible meaning. We've also got a question here, maybe both of you can engage with this. Why is it that many Christians seem actually resistant to accepting and dealing with historical injustices, particularly racial injustice? That's from Aaron.
Yeah. Steve, I might throw it to you first.
Look, and it's true, we see that. And I think there's a lack of confidence among Christians that the fact is the Bible's written for the losers, right? It's written into context of slaves and first century Christians in the Roman Empire. And there's something that power does to us in a way that we're never quite, we don't always see. So then if the document itself becomes the power document that shapes everything and no one can push against it.
By the document you mean?
If you use any text, even if you use the Bible to say we're going to run the whole country this way, I don't think we really want a theocracy at this stage, right? But it's a case too that you have to think, maybe we just don't believe our story enough, that it is a story of our own, the bad seed in our own heart that sprouts up through sin, and we don't believe that enough. And maybe we just haven't stopped to listen enough to the other stories, because history is written by the winners, but it's probably sung and spoken by the losers. And I mean that in the losers of history sense, right? That they're not winning, and maybe we just haven't listened to their stories enough, what they've sung and what they're saying. And I think Christians have to think hard. How do we move forward? How can we move forward in our culture if we don't listen to some of those stories, even if they cost us? And it's always about cost, isn't it? If I listen to that and I have to redress history, that may cost me. Yes, it might. And we have to think about that.
So you're saying that Christians could become more Christian when they engage with injustice?
Well, because the future world coming is a world of justice and mercy and combined.
Yes.
And how that plays out is the thing we're struggling to navigate, I think, not just in church, but wider in the culture.
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that one of the reasons why some groups of Christians can struggle with these kinds of issues is that increasingly we're less equipped, we're less historically literate, like I say in my talk. We don't actually have the kind of knowledge of history to be able to think about it, to be able to reason about it, or even the kind of knowledge of the Bible too, as a group of Christians, to be able to say, well, actually, the way that this actually plays out in practice is to be aware of sin. Like, what does that actually look like? If we can look at historical examples, we're better equipped to do the work of historical reconciliation.
This is for both of you again. Can we forgive the past? You've talked about this a little bit, Stephen. Do we need to? What does that look like?
Yeah, look, forgiveness, there's forgiveness and there's reconciliation. And what happens, if you forgive someone for an injustice, someone's got to wear it. And it's you. You take it in.
Yeah.
And I think part of the process of reconciliation is the person who's being forgiven saying, I'll bear some of that burden as well. So you take in the pain because you forgive someone who's wronged you. Reconciliation happens when that person who's wronged you said, you know what, let's figure out a way that I pay some of that cost and bear some of that weight. Unless we've got a structure to do that, we're just going to go around in circles, I think. And that's what I'd say.
Yeah. And another point of entry into that is to ask the question, well, given that forgiveness is enormously costly and depending on the degree of trauma, collective or individual, is it a cost that you individually can bear? Well, it's helpful to think, as a Christian, like if this were me, as a Christian, I have a God who bared the ultimate cost and forgave the ultimate sin. And so I think when you look at examples of historical communities who are grieving from incredible historical injustice or genocide, there are wonderful accounts of those who are Christians and who are able to grapple with that because they have a God who bore the ultimate injustice.
Beautiful. Can you believe it? We're at our final question for tonight already. I'll let you both jump in here again. if you have a few more thoughts to say on how can we value our past for the benefit of our future.
Do you want to go first?
The hard question. As a Christian too, I think we lean into our past and we honour the things in it that are worth honouring, and we own up to the things that are worth that we have to own up to. And that's whether that's a family or a community or a country. It's never done any good to us suppressing things that are awful in family systems, because they always come to the surface.
Oh, yeah.
That has to be multiplied in a community.
Yeah.
And I think Christianity gives you the tools to be able to do that, and also wear some of the cost, because it's not ultimately about you winning. The gospel story of Jesus flips things upside down. It's an upside down framework, that the way you are the greatest is to serve everyone. And we read that all the time in the Bible. If you read the Bible and you go, yeah, I know that. I've got it written on the car, a bumper sticker, but you're still cut in front of people with traffic. But it's like we have to ingrain that in ourselves. That's actually true, and lean into that, I think.
Yeah, yep. And I think too that, especially for people who are Christians, the more that they lean into the story of God's people, the more that they actually equip themselves to understand what does the story of God's people look like, not only in the Bible but also historically, that actually enables them to think about history in a way in which it can bear enormous fruit and help us think about, therefore understand who we are as part of a historical people, and therefore what it looks like to go into the future.
Sounds like it almost resources us to bear the cost and think wisely about the future. Yeah. Thanks so much, Stephen and Sarah. This has been such a great discussion on how to capture the past without cancelling the future. This has been a perfect topic to consider for our Third Space team. Third Space is a national initiative of City Bible Forum, providing an engaging community and space for intelligent conversation, as we've had tonight, about God. We'd love to connect with you in person. We have over 1,000 people engaged in our many networks around Australia, and there's certainly space for you. Before I leave, I'd like to draw your attention to the bottom of the event page, or the inside of your event booklet. Be sure to check out these resources. There are a couple of articles written by Stephen and Sarah. Stephen's written an article on selective memory loss, and Sarah called an ahistoric age. In just a moment, Russ Matthews will be back to share some important details about the feedback form that will be coming to you soon. We're now at the end of The Edge. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jeri Jones Sparks. I hope you enjoyed your night.